Hey everyone, hope doing well. This is Hayden Martin. This is my first IBC, so I'm really looking forward to all of this. Yeah, just a quick thing about me. I'm a motion designer, and I'm mainly working within the fields of sort of like fashion and luxury brands. I came from a background in music, visuals, basically, like so many of us. I was sort of like a VJ, but then I wanted to just have regular, wake sleep patterns. So I decided to get into slightly more commercial aspects of motion design, but I still do music videos and other sort of music related stuff. But what we're going to be talking about today is about some R&D that I did for a recent project, and that was for an outdoors company, and what they wanted was a cool reveal of their logo. And it's that classic kind of case of you're supplied with like a bitmap or a vector of the logo, and you're brainstorming like, how do we do something cool with this? How do we make this reveal? I've been given a bunch of vectors, what's that, splines, what am I going to do, like sweep these splines in a cool way or like extrude them? And I think it's quite easy to kind of get lost in just like this thing where, I'm just going to work with like extrudes and sweeps and lofts, and I think there's a lot more that you can do. So we decided to go with revealing the logo in terrain, basically, and the terrain that we were referencing was the Giant's Causeway in Ireland, which has really interesting morphology if you've seen it. Like it's just one of those crazy things where like volcanic pressure has sort of like pushed rock up and out of the earth in these really weird sort of like strands. It looks almost fibrous. And these strands have this kind of amazing sort of like perfectly packed sort of like honeycomb arrangement. So I'm no geologist, but like I tried to basically think about how these things are made, and how is the best way to get this nice organic geological kind of look. And this tutorial is going to be based on the R&D that I went through to achieve that look. Right, so let's get started. The first thing I'm going to do is put down a plane, and it's only because we're going to need it later. And because we're doing a landscape scene, we want it to be really big. So let's go over 100 meters by 100 meters. And you know what? I mean, probably be like, twice that size, just because we want it to be big. And also just, it might not matter so much at this scale. Maybe if you go bigger, just if you hit Control D, you can adjust your view clipping. I've got mine set to large, and this is just useful so that the draw distance in your viewport is bigger and you don't get sort of annoying clipping going on. Okay, so let's increase these subdivisions to 400 by 400, and we can hide that for now. Okay, now what we do is we bring our logo in. In this case, I'm not going to work with like a vector of the logo. I'm going to work in sort of like a worst case scenario kind of thing, I suppose, where you get a bitmap, where it's just like a black and white image or whatever color. There's a tool in Cinema called the Vectorizer. So if you hit Shift C and type in Vect and finish the rest, Vectorizer, and then set this to the same size as our plane, so to 20,000. Now we can select our logo, and that grayscale logo, I guess it's some kind of edge detection like algorithm or something like that, has basically been turned into splines as if it were a vector. Let's set the intermediate points to uniform, just so it's a little bit more of a kind of cleaner arrangement of points, and set our plane to XZ, so it's flat, so it's like a ground plane. If we get up close, we can see that there's not as much detail in this as we'd like, so if we bring our tolerance down to about 1, you'll see that a lot more detail comes back. And I think that's just really important, purely because, when you're dealing with clients who just want their logo visible, it's always important to kind of adjust that. I don't know what I'm getting at too much there. It's just that, the logo always needs to be visible. So let's current state that and hang on to this. Always hang on to stuff when you current state it, especially in this process, because it's a little bit destructive. But if you current state stuff, at least you have a copy of the original hierarchy that you used to make it, and you can always go back to it. So let's switch that off for now. Go into our point selection and just select the corner points and hit U. One moment. Select the corner points, hit U. Oh man. U and then W. And that selects all of the attached points. And that can go, you can just delete them. Now we have just the logo on its own. So what we do next is, if we hold Alt and click on Extrude, we'll get this nice raised, extruded version of our logo. And what we need to do next is go into our caps mode and just increase this to something like, 500. And in coordinates, increase this to 10. Alright, now what we're going to do is, this is kind of where it gets a bit interesting when we start to actually kind of create the foundations of that weird sort of like honeycomb array of polygons. Copy and paste this plane, so just control and drag it, make it visible, bring it up to here, and if we drop in a collision, so shift and click on collision, and set the collision mode to inside stretch and reference our extrude, you'll see that it kind of creates this slightly kind of like vacuum formed look. Okay, now this isn't what the final product's going to look like or anything like that. This is just part of the process. So yeah, I mentioned it will get a bit interesting. This is where we use a polyreduce object, and I kind of feel like it's misuse of the polyreduce, but yeah, let's have a look and then I'll talk you through it. So depending on your scene scale, how many polys you're doing, this might take a little while with the pre-processing, but it's pretty quick. If we go into our top view and then also into hidden line mode, you can see how the polyreduce algorithm works. As far as I can tell, it's just looking for like neighboring normals that are close to one another, and if they're close enough, then they can be merged, and essentially sort of like you can kind of cull groups of polygons and kind of merge them down. So what you can see here is where the plane was flat, it's really reduced down loads, and where we have the collision object where it's changing the angle quite dramatically, is unable to optimize and reduce as easily. Okay, so this is kind of like this contrast between high and low poly is too high at the moment. You need to remember that we're dealing with like natural rock formations and stuff like that, which do have natural sort of like fall-offs in frequency and detail. So we're going to kind of mess with the actual algorithm of the poly reduction object by introducing just a little bit more variance in these flat areas here. Okay, so first off we can switch that off, and let's just go back to our perspective view. And this is really simple. I'm not going to do anything crazy. I'm just going to basically chuck a displacer in here, and it's just going to be running some noise in. The only important thing to really think about when you're doing this is the direction of your displacer. We want it to be set to planar, and we want it to be +y. We don't want it to be set to vertex normal, because that would introduce sort of like swelling and intersection, because if a face is like that, then it's going to push out. We don't want that. We just want it to push up, which is why we're using planar set to +y. So let's chuck in some noise. Okay, and I think I'm just going to change the display mode. Is that going to change? Yeah. And let's crank this up to like 3000. Okay, and now let's increase the height as well. So let's just call this like 30 for the time being. Right. So now if we switch on poly reduction again, you'll see how this kind of like merging process like works in a way. And what we'll have is a sort of a less high contrast difference between high and low poly groups. And you can see that again if I go into top view and into hidden line mode. So we still have triangles here. It's not like they've all just been completely culled. We've got like a nice, maybe culled isn't the right word, maybe merged is the right word, or optimized, but you can see what I mean. Like, we have triangles here, but we still have nice dense triangles on the logo where we need that fidelity. Okay, so first off, I think I'm gonna try and smoothen this out a little bit, and the reason I want to do that is just so I can have a nice sort of like just that extra level of sort of like fall off from sort of like high poly to low poly, and you get some interesting kind of flowing patterns that I think feel quite natural and organic. So we've got our smoothing object there. Let's just Alt-G those together, and what you'll see is this surface suddenly sort of becomes a lot more nicely interpolated. Okay, so if I turn down, if I adjust the strength, you can see what's happening, right? That to me looks kind of scruffy. This looks kind of more natural, and how I'd expect it to be. Even though this isn't not a scientific process at all in any way, or is just in my mind, nature flows nicely. Okay, so let's current state this, and when we do that, again we can just switch off all of the old stuff, keep it lying around, because we will. You might need it back, like kind of later, if for whatever reason there's an issue. And here we have our editable plane. Now, the problem here is that this is still raised, and we want to just flatten this out. Okay, so what we'll do is let's just hit Control A, go to our scale tool, and then in our modeling axis of the scale tool, we can adjust this axis, and we want it to be as low as it can go. Basically, it's looking for the lowest point of the bounding box of the selection, as far as I can tell. And let's just hold Shift and dial this right back down to 0. And now what we have is a completely flattened out version of the mesh. We didn't have to like go into our coordinates or anything like that. We just did it within, the actual mesh itself. Now, if we go into our points mode, we can select all of these points and get them ready for the next step. So select them all with Control A, hit Shift C, and then type in set selection. And now you can see it's created a selection tag, and they're particularly useful because you can make all sorts of different selections, but if you want to get back to something that you had before, you just double click it and it will be there. Okay, so what we do next involves subdivision, and it's important that you use the right subdivision type, which is Catmull Clark. This is subdivided too much. We only need it subdivided once, like this. And you can kind of see now a little bit more of that hexagonal kind of like packing shape, that kind of like weird like honeycomb effect. You know, if you look at it, you can kind of see that there's almost like these kind of like circular hexagony arrangements of stuff going on. But the problem is it's all quadded, and we actually just want sort of like n-gons basically, which are combinations of polygons that can allow for shapes other than quads and tris. So again, what we're going to do is current state this subdivision surface and switch it off and hide it. And because we created that selection tag, we now have access to those individual points, even though the mesh has actually changed. And what we're going to do with these points is clear them away, which will give us our n-gons. So if we go to mesh, remove and melt, and just give it a moment, you might think it's frozen or something like that. It hasn't, it's just computing in the background. What you'll get is quite an interesting looking mesh, like this. Okay? So we have kind of this cool, like packed geo going on, which falls off into these really nice, sort of like super detailed, kind of like flowing arrangements of like these honeycomb cells, maybe is the best way to put it. You know, you've got this kind of cool, kind of like flowing shape here, and it looks almost like it was molten. You know, it looks like it was molten at one point and then it's set, just like lava or something like that. Right, so that's all good. The next part that we're kind of going to move on to is extruding this surface and actually beginning to kind of create our mountainous landscape stuff. You know, our mountainous landscape geology. I think. Yeah. Okay, so the way we're going to do that is by breaking up these individual n-gons from their neighboring n-gons. We don't want them to be sort of like joined, you know, like this. You know, we don't want these points to be all like welded together. We want them to become separate. So the fastest way that I found to do that is by using the shatter object. So if I hold shift and click and drop the shatter in here and just zero these values out, if I start to increase strength, you'll see what I mean. Now the points have kind of unwelded. So let's just keep it at 10 for the time being, just so you can see what's going on. And now what we're going to do is use a MoGraph effector as a deformer. And this is always something I always forget about, well, until recently anyway. Now I use it all the time, but you know, MoGraph effectors I always affiliate with just like the cloners and matrix objects and stuff like that. But you know, they can, when you use them as deformers, it's pretty cool actually what you can do with them. In this case, we just need, you know, a really basic plane. And if you go into deformer and set this to polygon, you'll see that they just shifted a little bit. They shifted on the wrong axis though. They didn't shift on the Y, they shifted on the Z. We'd need to fix that by adjusting our transform space and just set it to object. And now you can see that they're going, you know, in the correct axis. So, obviously with effectors you can use fall-offs and fields. So if I chuck in a spherical field and make that, you know, larger, you'll start to see the foundations of like the effect that we're after. And just so this is all a little bit more sort of like clearer, so we have a clearer idea of like this shape, we're going to use the cloth surface to extrude these polys. So alt and click the cloth surface. You can bring the subdivisions down, and then if you if you put negative values in here and start, increasing those negative values or decreasing them, you'll eventually get this like interesting geo going on. And if I just put it into this mode, you can see you've got these individual steps, just like the Giant's Causeway. And the reason I'm doing negative values is because I still want to be able to treat this like a ground plane. If it was positive, all of a sudden my ground plane would be like higher than it was when I started, I suppose is the best way to put it. Like I don't want it to extrude upwards where my ground plane is still here. I want it to extrude downwards, and my ground plane is remaining sort of like zeroed out and in the center of our scene. Okay, so let's just make this negative 3000 for the time being. Okay, so we have our fall off in there, but we don't want to use like a spherical field as our fall off, really. What we want is to be able to use our logo as our fall off. So let's just delete the spherical field for the time being, and let's also just hide this. And this is where we come back to that plane that we put in the scene at the beginning. So if we switch that on and just go into hidden line mode, you can see it's nice and dense. And the reason it's dense is because we kind of want to treat each poly in this like a kind of a pixel. We want it to be quite high res for what we do next. Okay, so first off we make this editable, and then we go into poly mode, Control A, Shift C, and then set vertex weight. Hit OK. And if we're going into our regular kind of flat shading mode, you can see that we've just created basically a weight map, and it's all set to 0. We don't want it set to 0. We want it to be inheriting strength from the texture. Okay, so what we're going to do is create just a regular material PBR and chuck it on here. And in the PBR material, if we just go into luminance and select our texture, you'll see it's stuck down in the exact same kind of place and coordinates as how it appeared in our vectorizer, and that's purely because we just made sure that our vectorizer and plane were the same size. Okay, so we can exit that, and if we go into our weight map, we can go into fields, and in fields we can use a shader field, and we can reference the luminance channel from this texture tag, and there we have the texture driving fields. And the only reason I've kind of done it like this rather than just kind of plugging something into a custom shader, like a file, is because I still want access to my UV controls. I don't know how you're going to use this, but if you wanted to use it on this technique or whatever, on anything other than a plane basically, or if something was like UV'd in a custom way, you still have access to all of that control. Alright, so let's go back into the weight map and just invert these values, because we want positive values in the logo, because what we want is to raise up the terrain at that point. If you inverted it, it would sink down, I guess. I think that's how it'd be. So if we go into back into our cloth surface and we go into our plane, now we can just drag in the weight map, and that's our fall off. And as you can see, if we just hide that plane, that reference plane, we now have our logo extruded, and we can see like this nice high fidelity detail from where the triangles were denser at the beginning whilst we were using the poly reduce object. Okay, so we've got a nice dense arrangement of these kind of cool packed rocks. Okay, so to me still though this looks very CG, right? This doesn't look natural at all, and that's because we need to create that nice sort of like lead up into these shapes. Right now, you know, it's way too you know, rigid. So in our plane, in our vertex map, let's first off just set this to max. And if we control and click and drag down, it'll create another one. But with this one, we want to change our mode, and we just want to change it to average. And you'll see what effect it has. You know, it's suddenly starting to kind of like blur out just a little bit. It's becoming softer. It's a softer fall off, which is a really nice kind of like natural looking kind of feature. So if we just switch off that one, we can get a clearer look at what's going on. So I think let's start with 1,000. Okay. Now we've got these mounds basically, and we want them to lead up into this nice vertical form. So let's control and click and drag again, and just half this value. You can start to see it's easing into that shape. Okay, going to do it again. And once more. Now if we switch on this kind of base one, what we should have is this cool kind of like ramping into it. I still think maybe it's a little bit hard, but you know, I think that's up to you to sort of, you know, get into refining. You can play with these maps as much as you want really, and you can get all sorts of different effects. But right now, I'm happy enough with it. Although the top is still like way too flat. It's as flat as our ground plane here. You know, this just needs to be. This needs to be a little bit more irregular, I think, to sell it when our camera view is on a ground level before it goes up above for the reveal. Okay, so the way we're going to do that is just introduce some noise like we did earlier. Just chuck in a shader field at the top, and we're going to set this to normal. So it's applying across the, like, you know, black and white of values, and not just like being multiplied or added in. Okay, and in that field we're just going to choose noise, and we can, I don't know, increase this to like 500 or something. And I always just go wavy turbulence really, just because it just gives that extra little bit of sort of like kind of like scruffiness to the noise that looks just a little bit less default. Maybe let's make this 1,000. I want to start seeing like some noise pattern, but not too much. 2,000. We set this to world space. Might change things. Let's just roll with this. Okay, and now if we go into blending on that shader field, just bring it down to like 20% or 25 even. So we're preserving our overall shape. We've just introduced a little bit more irregularity in the you know, y-axis. Okay, so you know, if we're down here, we got like a kind of camera view down here, and then all of a sudden, like a drone, it just goes like and launches up. We've got this kind of like reveal of the logo, right? So I think this is in a pretty good place now. I think we could probably make it just a little bit more dramatic by increasing this value to like, you know, 3,000, just so these are a bit steeper. And I think it just looks like a little bit more kind of crazy. And you know, maybe the shader field is a little bit too much at this point as well. So we could bring that down maybe to like half of what it is. So just divide 25 by 2, 12.5. And you know, if you want this to kind of like soften off into a kind of flat area here, you could probably use like the vertex map set to average, inverted, and then like multiply it onto it on top of all of this. So like, you know, once you're out of a particular kind of threshold of that map, it suddenly sort of like zeroes out. But what I do next is actually going to kind of solve this problem anyway. Alright, so let's drop in a plane. Again, like I think it was 20,000 by 20,000 centimeters. And, you know, I think if we make this 200 by 200 and bring it up just a bit, we'll start to see what effect it's having. So, you know, this plane could be anything. It could be water, it could be sand. In this case, I'm going to imagine it's sand. And just so I can kind of like visualize the way that these materials kind of interpolate a little bit better, I'm just going to change the colors in my viewport, and you know, just it's a good way whilst you're just like fleshing out and blocking out stuff, just to have an understanding of, you know, like how much am I actually going to see when it comes to rendering this thing. Okay, so you know, let's make this like a kind of cool, kind of canyony, orangey red. This could probably be a little bit more yellow. All right, and if you know, let's just chuck a displacer in here. Let's put some noise in. Make the noise really big, like 3,000. Okay, and you know, increase the height maybe to like 100. Now you can see we're starting to get this kind of like, you know, June-y kind of effect. Now, obviously we're just kind of like blazing through this tutorial, and it's really just to give you sort of an insight into how I went about building the scene. These are the fundamentals of it, but what you could do is actually use real like height data from like satellite images. Because if you've ever seen sort of like a height map of terrain or anything, it's basically the same as like your regular bump map, displacement map. It's just a grayscale image determining like, you know, a low point and a high point from black to white. So if you wanted really realistic dunes, sand dunes, maybe you could find a really nice satellite you know, height map of actual dunes, and you can get that really nice like randomness that you just kind of get that maybe you can't necessarily achieve so quickly with like noise shaders and stuff like that, you know. Same goes for this. The reason we used a texture tag there to drive the weight map that is, you know, creating the actual elevation is not just because we want UV mapping. It's because maybe I want to pipe in again like height data, you know, satellite height data, and it doesn't have to just be a logo, it could be anything, you know. I think that's what's really important to kind of like remember here. For that kind of like realism, it's really nice to try and have sort of like real like scanned sort of like displacement materials and things like that, because obviously in this viewport right now it just looks like really flat and stuff, but when you render it with like really nice displacement maps and things like from Megascans or something, all of a sudden it'll really come to life, and you know, it'll all be pretty low poly, you know, like I mean, like this is all pretty manageable at the point, you know, at this point, you know, it's complicated, but it's not really high poly, so it's still pretty responsive. Okay, so yeah, let's just, I think, make this just, yeah, let's double the size of this dune stuff just so we can see a little bit more. And you know, you could even take it a step further. In the animation that I made earlier, I had water, and that, you know, that was quite nice just because it introduced a little bit more reflection, and then it made it feel a little bit more like kind of an oasis kind of scene. You know, you just, you know, adjust your water load as how you want. The way I kind of think about like this point is like the level builders in like Far Cry and stuff like that. If you ever played that game, like you can just kind of adjust like water levels and stuff like that. It's quite cool. And you know, if you want to get really deep into it, one of the things that I did in a video was like scatter plants, and I just created a small fall off to determine where the plants would be growing. So typically they'll be around the edge of the water, just because of the way they root and stuff like that. Okay, so yeah, I think that will do for today. I hope this is all, you know, like useful to you, and that you kind of like use this in an interesting way. And I'd really love to know if there's a particular way of achieving that sort of like end-gone surface mesh without having to kind of like make things editable. You know, if we can kind of do this where everything just kind of remains in like a hierarchy, and we're not having to sort of like be destructive in our workflow along the way, that'd be amazing, because all of a sudden we can have so much more kind of like granular control over these, you know, this kind of like blocking out stage that we're doing. Okay, so I hope you have fun, and yeah, let's catch up soon. I guess, like, just get at me in the comments, and then we can talk about this some more. All right, thanks, see ya.